completed the first part of the homework, making this thing look acceptable. Next, make the form work. What do I mean by work? I mean basically add it to a list, right? Type these things in and have them add to note list. So there are two parts of that. Making something happen when we do something with the form, and making sure that the note list renders the list of notes. Again, we don't really have to tie those two things together. We just have to do both parts. We have to first make sure that, well, we can do them in either order, but we have to both make sure that stuff that is in some array or some object or something shows up on the list, so that whenever we change the list in state, it changes in the HTML, in the DOM. And then we just need to make sure that the form is able to put stuff wherever note list is looking for that data, right? I'm going to start with the list. I'm going to start with making sure that if we have some data object in our code, its contents get printed out in that list. So I'm going to start there. And I already answered this in what I just said, but where does that data need to live? Where should the list of notes, data-wise, actually appear in our code? In an array or an object would be fine. Just a variable somewhere? Just a property of some object? Where should we put it? Where should we put the data that's kind of core to this thing in React world? It is in a component. It's in the component's state. Right? So we have state and props. State is what we're interested in right now. That's where the list of notes will actually live. And that's where the JSX will look for it when it prints it on the page. So then the question becomes, state on which component? Yeah, Naomi. In main? So note list is where we're using it right now, right? So we can put it there. But this has got to, the form's got to be able to get data there too, right? So it needs to be high enough in our component hierarchy that both of these things can see it. You get that? Because how do you pass data from one component to another? We use props. And note list cannot pass props to note form. They're siblings. It would have to be at least as high up as main. Now, whether we do main or app, I'm not sure there's any reason that we couldn't use main for now. Once we add authentication, I think that may make our lives more difficult. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in app. But that's only because I kind of know where this is going. Otherwise, main would have been a very reasonable choice. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in app. So app will have some state. And to add state, we know we need to set the initial state, which we can do in the constructor. So it is important that app is a class and not a stateless functional component because it is not stateless. So that also means, since we have a constructor, we need to make sure we call the constructor from the superclass component so that all the React-y stuff happens. Then we can set the initial state. And this time around, I'm going to make it an object instead of an array. And you'll see why. And inside, so state needs a notes property, which that's what I meant is an object instead of an array. State is obviously an object. So if I tried, let's make sure, first of all, I have no errors. If I left out the constructor, I would get an error. This is not allowed before super. So it's not going to do it and break and just not work right. It's going to actually stop you from doing it. So for right now, I'm going to hard code a note inside this object so that we can figure out whether we're rendering the list correctly. So here's why I made it an object instead of an array. Instead of indexing it by 0, 1, 2, 3, etc., I'm going to make it the ID of the thing. And my IDs are eventually going to have a format like this, like note-1, colon, some object, comma, note-2, colon, some object. Notice I had to put quotes around this before the colon because it has a dash in it. We can usually leave the quotes off on object keys, but only if we follow the naming rules for JavaScript variables. And note-1 would not be a valid variable name, so we have to put quotes around it. So that this note will have an ID of note1. That's the whole point. We'll give it a title of thoughts on React. And the body of React is pretty nifty. Declarative for the win guitar emoji. Copy and paste. On a Mac, you can get this emoji viewer pretty easily if you go to your character stuff and set a preference that it should show up in your bar up here. And we're using Unicode, so we can put that in the middle of our code file, and it works. Note 2, we'll give an ID. Oops, that doesn't need quotes. An ID of note-2. A title. Title of state and props. And a body of lat. So that our initial state has a couple of notes in it. They're not going to stick around for a really long time, but they're there for now so we can make sure that we do this loop right. Yeah, what's up? So for those, when you put quotes around note-1, note-2, yes. How do you access those? So you could not do note this dot state dot notes dot note1, right? But you can use brackets. Because otherwise you'd get to the end of this class and kind of never have made that connection. When you do, I've said it several times, when you do and don't have to quote the string names. We've never encountered one where we actually had to do it. So we're doing it now. If you really don't want to do it in your code, I'm not going to like dock points or something. Okay. So now we have an initial state. How can we actually use that on the page? It's the list that's supposed to print these out, right? But the state is on app. How can we get this object from here to note list? Props. Through props. If we want to pass data from one component to another, we do it through props. And props just look like attributes on a tag. Well, note list isn't here, but main is, and note list is inside that. So I guess we're going to have to go through a middleman here. Say main, and then the name we want to use to refer to this inside the other component, we'll call it notes, and we'll set it to, don't forget curly braces because this is a JavaScript thing, and it's this.state.notes that we want to pass in. Nots. Yes, notes matches notes here. Nothing magic about that. This could be ye notes or something else. You can call it whatever you want there. I don't want to give it a silly name, though. So now we are passing a prop to main. So inside main, how do I get to it? Main here is a stateless functional component. And actually that kind of helps us drive home the point of what props really are. We said props are like arguments that you pass to a function, right? If you have data from outside a function that you want to get into that function, the way you do that is by passing arguments to that function, right? And props are the same idea. We want to load this component, and we want it to have access to certain data that isn't already there. So we pass it in as a prop instead of an argument. Since main happens to be a functional type component, in other words, the entire component is just a function, at this point the props aren't just like arguments. Props is an argument. So props is going to be passed as an argument to this function. And when we do it this way, the name props isn't magic. It's just the argument that's getting passed in. And just like you do anytime you write a function, you choose what your arguments are going to be referred to as inside that function. But for the sake of everyone's sanity, please call it props. Makes it a little less hard to keep track between functional stateless components and full-on class components. So now inside here, we don't say this.props, right? This isn't an object. It isn't a class. It's just a function. Functions are objects, but not the point. It's just an argument, right? So there's just a local variable named props now. So props.note or props.notes would be the notes that we passed in. And we don't have anything to do with them in main except that we need to pass them on to note list, right? So again, we pass them down to note list as a prop. So again, the prop is called notes, and it should be what? How do I get that list? Props.note, right? Notes. Props.notes. What's that? So props are the props of main, but they are passed in. So if app didn't happen to include notes equal something, then props.note wouldn't be there. So since there was a prop passed in called notes, anywhere inside this main function, we could refer to the notes as props.notes. We don't have anything to do with them besides pass them on to note list. And props.notes is how we refer to them internally in this component. So we again add a prop that we pass into note list. And it'll have a value of props.notes. So going down to note list, again, it's a stateless functional component. The entire component is just a function, which means that props passed into it are not just like arguments. Props itself is an argument. So let's make sure we assign a name to it. Just like the event that gets passed to an event listener, it doesn't enforce the number of arguments. If you leave it out of the argument list, that won't stop it from getting passed in. You just won't be able to do anything with it. So we call it props here. Then we can do something with props.note. Props.notes. So we want to do the same thing we did in Dwarf Underground and the same thing we did in React Robats. We now have this list of things, and for each one of those, we want to spit something out onto the page, right? So we have a list of things, and we want to do the same thing to each one. What do we use when we want to do that? This is just JavaScript. Map, right? The map is for arrays, not objects. And I had to be tricky and make notes an object this time. So how can we get an object out of, an array out of that object? We can get the keys, right? With object.keys. So let's see about that. Inside this UL, let's put some JavaScript. So object.keys props.notes would give us an array containing what? The string note 1 and the string note 2, right? So we could map over that. And what gets passed in to the function inside note or map? Each item of the array, right? And the array contains, again, note 1, note 2, the strings, just the IDs. So I'm going to call that note ID inside here. And then what do I want to do for each one of those? I want to spit out an LI containing, like, heck, let's just start with the note title. So I could say inside this map, return. Oh, I suppose I could just return some JSX. Why not? And inside there, I could say, heck, I could start with just printing out note ID, just to see if that much even works. Does that work? Note 1, note 2, and then the one that I hard-coded in there. We've got a warning here. Each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. Remember this? So the LI should have a prop on it, an attribute for key. And each of these LIs needs to have a different one. So what's unique? The note ID is, right? So that ought to do it. And the warning's gone. Yay. But we don't really just want the ID in there, right? We want the title and body. But this is getting a little more complicated. My spidey sense is tingling. I see a component approaching. Let's create a new component. What would you call it? Note. Seems like a good name. Let's add a new component called note. Note.js. Import React from React. I'm going to make it a stateless functional component again. Const note equal arrow function. Before I forget, export default note. We're going to have to return some JSX. That JSX is going to be an LI. And we're going to probably be passing some props down here, right? Containing the actual note. So make sure we put props here. But right now, I'm just gonna hard code something in here. This came from note component, just to get it all wired up. Here's my note component on the right, note list on the left. So we need to import it, right? In note list, import note from note. And then, instead of this li, I can just return note component. Now, in order to get the note ID and all that other stuff, in order to be able to get into that from note, yes, we have to pass something into it, right? We have to pass some props. Is anybody surprised to still hear that? You don't have to answer, but you can answer if you want to. But to call, we're essentially just calling this note function, and it needs to know about the data inside this note. So we need to make sure we pass it in, basically as an argument. And the way we do that with JSX is we pass in a prop. Yeah.
I missed the note.js too.
Okay, we're getting ready to flip right back to it. Okay. So what do we want to pass in? Not really the note ID so much as the whole note, right? Don't necessarily need the whole list, but we need the individual note. So what should that be? So props.notes is the list of all the notes, right? How do I get to that note? Loud and proud, Natalie. Yes. Square brackets, note ID, right? So props.notes is the same object as this, containing all our notes, but it's not an array, it's an object, so it's indexed by these strings. And how do we get those properties out of that object? With square brackets. And we just so happen to have a variable here containing the ID for this particular one. Now our need to pass in a key doesn't disappear because we change it from li to note. Each one of these is still going to need a unique identifier because it's still coming out of a loop. So we also need to pass in a key of note ID. And now we see this came from note component. This came from note component. We still got this one hard-coded in. So here's note.js right now. And we're about to change this, of course, from being hard-coded to actually containing the data of a note. So we know the li should look something like this. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this hard-coded one out of here. And inside Node.js, my JSX is going to look something like that. But the note title, instead of being hard-coded to citizens of distant epochs, should be what? Yeah, what props did we pass in? We passed in note. We have a prop of note. So props.note.title. Props.note will be one of these, each of which has ID, title, and body. Props.note.title. And then inside the body, props.note.body. Could it be? Thoughts on React? React is pretty nifty, declared for the win. State and props, what? Not bad. Yes.
Could you explain, like the naming, like what we passed in like a bunch of times props dot this dot props dot notes, but we kept referring, even though we passed in the notes, we're still saying props dot. I'm not following.
Yeah, sure. So let's think about really normal functions outside of React, because ultimately this is just JavaScript. Sure, yeah, because it does work now, right? So add note component and render our hard-coded notes dynamically. Then we'll dive into this slightly more about props conversation.